Greetings. I'm Dr. Gordon Carkner, and I'm giving you a seminar on late modernity, the challenge of scientism and the quest for meaning. It's a pleasure to be discussing some of these important issues. We try to back things up with good scholarship, and I hope you can find it insightful and helpful, sending you in the right directions. I'm a meta educator for postgraduate students at UBC, University of British Columbia, the author of The Great Escape from Nihilism and Mapping the Future. And this is our graduate student blog, ubcgcu.org. So I hope that some of you can participate in that as well, learn more. This is where I work, which is rather a beautiful campus on the tip of a peninsula in Vancouver, British Columbia. The mountains as a background. That's the city of Vancouver in the distance. So what are some of the heavy hitters in this area of scientism, or I would say the ideology of scientism? We want to provide a critique of that and say, how can we move beyond scientism in our late modern era? And here are some of the heavy hitters. Michael Polanyi, his book, Personal Knowledge, Charles Taylor, in his Secular Age, especially chapter 15, I found that very helpful on the idea of the immanent frame. David Bentleyhart, a philosopher, the Experience of God, particularly the first half of that book, I found really insightful. He's extremely articulate and incisive. Alistair McGrath is a famous scientist, theologian at Oxford University, and his book, A Fine-Tuned Universe, is a fine picture of how knowledge comes from both science and theology. Tom McLeish, Faith and Wisdom in Science. He's at York University at this time, York in Northern England. And he's been one of our speakers in recent years. He's very articulate on the interface between the humanities and the social sciences and science, hard sciences. And yeah, quite a good writer as well. Alvin Plantinga is a philosopher from Notre Dame University. And this is his famous book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, which looks at evolution and whether evolution fits with scientific naturalism, or that is philosophical naturalism. John Polkinghorne from Cambridge University was head of Queen's College. For most of his life, he was a physicist, and then he became a theologian. So he's been a theologian of the science-theology interface, the interaction of science and theology. Quite a helpful introductory book to John Polkinghorne. I think you'd really enjoy his writing. It's very clear, very sharp. And then in the social sciences, Stephen Klein, The Science of Happiness. I found that a very helpful book on understanding there's more to life than just what science can show us. And then Jennifer Wiseman, who was one of our speakers a few years ago, she is very articulate. She's a member of the Hubble Space Telescope group for NASA. So these are some of a few. There are many more. We'll mention other people as we go through this seminar. Well, as we stand before the universe with billions of stars and galaxies, there is a great sense of wonder of how it all fits together and who are we in the midst of that vast universe. And that sense is to think and to reflect and to philosophize and that sort of thing. So it's not just the scientific facts about the universe we want to discover, but it's more about everything that's available in the universe. So entering this discussion, leading neuroscientist from Stanford University, William Newsome, he's in the School of Medicine, in a recent talk at UBC noted that the major conflict between science and faith stems from more of an ideology, not from the nature of science itself. For a belief to be considered valid or credible, scientism, he said, requires that it be scientifically testable. Thus, many claims to knowledge are devalued, discredited, or even excluded on that premise. And on the philosophical side, eminent Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who I have a high respect for and did a lot of work on during my PhD, he captures scientism's potency in the language of the immanent frame. He says this in A Secular Age, a 2007 tome. We can come to see the growth of civilization or modernity as synonymous with the laying out of a closed immanent frame. Within this, civilized values develop and a single-minded focus on the human good, aided by the fuller and fuller use of scientific reason, permits the greatest flourishing possible of human beings. What emerges from all this is that we can either see the transcendent as a threat, a dangerous temptation, a distraction, or an obstacle to our greatest good. You'll hear more about Taylor in the rest of this talk. So I want to start with these 5 or 6 cultural identifiers of scientism. And you could say, we could also call it the malaise of modernity. Taylor has a book called The Malaise of Modernity, or The Ethics of Authenticity. So let's go through these 5, 6 cultural identifiers, and then we'll look at some diagnosis. This is more the diagnosis side of things, and then we'll look at a prognosis. How do we move forward from scientism? How do we escape its trap, its vice? So first of all is the epistemological claim. No knowledge is deemed valid or justified unless its claims can be tested and verified empirically through experimentation, observation, and repetition. This criterion is part of an intellectual house of the mind which controls the way people think, argue, infer, and make sense of things. Truth claims that do not submit to this kind of scrutiny automatically become irrelevant, invalid, implausible, or unacceptable. This principle of knowledge is heavily weighted or biased towards the instrumental and the mechanistic. Its attraction is to a greater certainty, especially that of the mathematical or statistical type. B, the utopian sentiment. And this is more of a common cultural sentiment of scientism. Science is a futuristic guide to human progress, both intellectually and culturally. Past tradition, especially that influenced by the Christian religion, or any religion really, is taken as false opinion or superstition, even dangerous, as you see in Yuval Noah Harari, his famous book, Sapiens, and the other one, Homo Deus. The growth of scientific knowledge is thought to guarantee social and political progress. Scientism entails a warfare model in the science-religion relationship, a posture that began in the mid-19th century, as articulated by historian of science Colin Russell in his book Cross Currents. So part of this is the concept of secularity too, that Charles Taylor articulates in A Secular Age. It assumes that as science advances, religion will be culturally displaced, demoted in importance, replaced basically. This extreme optimism is found in the transhumanism discourse, that is, the world beyond the human, and is the tone we often find in Wired magazine or the Humanist Manifesto. Quentin Schultz, who's a thinker who looks at modern technology, speaks about this kind of utopian optimism in the habits of the high-tech heart. I'm going to read to you a quote from the Humanist Manifesto, so you get a sense of the passion. The next century, this is written in the 20th century, the next century can and should be the humanist century. Dramatic scientific, technological, and ever accelerating social and political changes crowd our awareness. We have virtually conquered the planet, explored the moon, overcome the natural limits of travel and communication. We stand at the dawn of a new age. Using technology wisely, we can control our environment, conquer poverty, markedly reduce disease, extend our lifespan, significantly modify our behavior, and alter the course of human evolution. And those sentiments are quite alive today as well in the 21st century. You don't have to look too far to find that kind of thing. Thirdly, or C, intellectual exclusion or hegemony. Insights from the humanities, philosophy, and theology are treated with suspicion. That is, the poetry of life is removed from scientism by scientism. Scientific rationalism dismisses faith as mere fideism, belief without good reasons, or non-evidential. Often people will say that faith is a kind of belief in something that is the opposite of the evidence, where the scientific evidence leads. So scientism's inherent materialism, that is the belief that we're nothing but time, space, energy, matter, it entails that science refuses mystery, the metaphysical, or anything transcendent, the miraculous, even the mythic, metaphorical, or epiphanic. Certain common ways of knowing are simply written off, ignored, or treated with contempt. It's easy to find examples of this among the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. We'll talk about Sam Harris in a minute. Fourth, or D, the anthropological consequences of scientism. Under scientism, people are viewed as sophisticated cogs in the cosmic machinery, or simplified as merely the most intelligent animals, the higher primates. All human characteristics, including the mind or soul, are believed to be explicable in terms of bodily functions, neural networks, DNA makeup, biochemistry or physiology, or at bottom, physics and chemistry. A philosophical, what is called ontological reductionism is at work here. The methodology with which we look at the world morphs into ontology. The way we look at the world begins to be seen as reality itself. This is the phenomena of nothing but. The higher order is explained in terms of the lower, mind in terms of brain, human social behavior in terms of ant colonies, as we see in E.O. Wilson. Humans are appreciated for their instrumental value, their earning capacity, socio-political usefulness, and their excellence or giftedness. We see this kind of reductionism in E.F. Schumacher, A Guide for the Perplexed, an older book, or a more recent book by Regent Professor Craig Gay, The Way of the Modern World. An atheist who articulates this position is Thomas Nagel in his book, The Mind and Cosmos. Nagel became very controversial among his atheist colleagues when he began to question materialistic naturalism. Fifth, or E, scientism and ethics. In this area, science is seen to normatively provide a more reliable and superior decision-making guide. It becomes a new alternative to religion and traditional morals in discerning the good and shaping the moral self or moral discourse. There are two books that are on the opposite sides of this issue. Sam Harris's book. Sam Harris is one of the famous new atheists. You'll find a lot of his videos on YouTube. His book, The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Values. He believes that science will come in and replace religion as a foundation for the moral order, the moral fabric of society, the moral good. Alternatively, James Davison Hunter and Paul Nedoletsky at University of Virginia write this book where they question that foundation, whether science can actually provide a foundation for ethics. In their book, Science and the Good, The Tragic Quest for Foundations of Morality. So these are dueling ideas. Under ethics, science asserts dominance as a culture sphere, absorbs and redefines morality in scientific categories, meeting a scientific agenda. Scientism claims that the scientific principle, scientific rationality, is applicable to all things, all arenas of life, all culture spheres. Religious or personal moral values are to be kept to the private sphere of one's life, but not to be part of public discourse. Famous book of this persuasion, or at least that articulates this view, is Lesslie Newbigin, Foolishness to the Greeks. The final category, final diagnosis of scientism that we want to cover today is the weakness of language. Within scientism, within the scientism frame or map of reality, knowledge depends on a designative versus an expressive, poetic, or constitutive tradition of language. Designative language, that is, that from the tradition of Hobbes to Locke to Condillac, traps the pursuit of wisdom within language and confines it to immanence, where language and its relationship to truth are reduced to pointing or representation. Language primarily designates objects in the world. The object is held and studied at a distance, observed but not participated in. One assumes a use of language based on quantitative judgments that are non-subject dependent or quote unquote objective. This view of language contributes to scientism's mechanistic understanding of the universe, rendering the universe disenchanted without soul or mystery. For a fuller treatment of these two major types of language, see Charles Taylor's tome, The Language Animal, which he says took him 30 years to write, to think about and to write. In my book, The Great Escape from Nihilism, I'll show you a copy of that later, I also compare the epistemological to the hermeneutical way of seeing and understanding the world. It's a similar insight into the same problem. But here's a quote from Charles Taylor in The Language Animal, or in A Secular Age. Our language has lost its constitutive power, denotative versus expressive. This means that we can deal instrumentally with realities around us, but their deeper meaning, the background in which they exist, the higher reality which finds expressions in them, is ignored and often invisible to us. Our language has lost the power to name things in their embedding, their deeper, richer, and higher reality. The current incapacity of language is a crucial factor in our incapacity of seeing well and our personal flourishing. Our language, our vision, and our lives remain flattened in late modernity. That's a very significant statement. So in a sense, scientism, if you're looking at the four different culture spheres, the religious, the ethical, the scientific, and the aesthetic, scientism actually sees the scientific as the center, and all the other spheres revolve around it, or can be judged or adjudicated by it. Like in this case, scientific sphere of culture actually eliminates the religious and substitutes or undergirds the ethical, and probably eliminates the aesthetic as well. There's a sense in which the scientific outlook doesn't care for the humanities. So what's the big picture here? I think it's articulated well by David Bentleyhart in his book, The Experience of God, that first half. An admirably severe discipline of interpretive and theoretical restraint, i.e. modern empirical science, has been transformed into its perfect and irrepressibly wanton opposite. What began as a principled refusal of metaphysical speculation for the sake of specific empirical inquiries is now being mistaken for a comprehensive knowledge of the metaphysical shape of reality. The art of humble questioning has been mistaken for the sure possession of ultimate conclusions. This makes a mockery of real science. So this is the belief, as we've been pushing towards, that science explains everything that we need to know. All knowledge is scientific, all true knowledge, all sound knowledge is scientific knowledge. So what we are seeing with scientism is that it acts as a kind of prison of the mind. It doesn't let us think outside this particular box. The ideology is a picture of the world that holds our minds captive. For some of the reasons above, scientism can lead us to nihilism, cynicism, addictions, and despair, the malaise of modernity that Charles Taylor talks about. This is a logical progression from the epistemology, ontology, and anthropology of scientism to the moral confusion and identity crisis of late modernity. You might say the identity crisis of millennials today as well. Scientism alienates and oppresses us. We intuitively see ourselves as more than machines, more than animals, beings with purpose. The dogma of scientism stifles and even questions our freedom and agency. It cramps and constricts our imagination, even in the practice of science itself. Ultimately, scientism threatens the human quest for meaning. And that is the major point of this presentation that should shock you and help you realize the importance of this discussion. So let's put scientism under the philosophical microscope. And many authors do this, and I'll mention a few here. We won't be able to go into all of these points, but I'll just list these particular points about where scientism falls short. It's possible that we could do another presentation on these points alone. Scientism holds an inaccurate view of science and a skewed view of the history of science. We see this in Michael Polanyi, Tom McLeish, and Peter Harrison. It perverts the principles of science itself, as in Peter Medawar. It's not honest about the methodological limitations of science, David Bentley Hart. It entails serious logical problems. Several top philosophers agree, Alvin Plantinga, Thomas Nagel, Charles Taylor. And it impoverishes, at the end of the day, our anthropology, our idea of what it means to be human. It reduces it or dumbs it down. E.F. Schumacher, Del Ratch. So how do we actually, at the end of the day, recover from scientism's opiate, its opiate or opioid impact? All philosophy is a participation in humanity's common struggle to attain truth. We know well, especially in our post-truth era, that there can be no freedom or justice without a high value on truth and evidence-based conclusions. If scientism is destructive in its intellectual, moral, and human consequences, what constitutes a more positive trajectory? What is the integrated stance that takes seriously the full range of the human imagination and a robust, full-blooded human identity? What will bring reconciliation between science and the humanities, science and religion, to help us make better sense of our world and to have a more holistic understanding of the world? What is science's proper place in late modernity amidst all the culture spheres of beauty, goodness, spirituality, and other forms of knowledge? Well, we're taking a several part approach to recovery from scientism, and the first recovery point is related to wisdom, a relationship to wisdom. And here we say that science must be more engaged with and tempered by wisdom. Natural philosophy or science is philosophos, the love of wisdom about natural things. That prompts person to use all the skills of reason in the quest to make sense of the world. French intellectual Jacques Maritain cautions that science without wisdom, at the end of the day, is blind. And Albert Einstein said, let's not forget that matter is not all that really matters. This relates to his concern that you can't really describe fully a great musical concert with science alone, and his concern about the ethics of splitting the atom, because he was part of that process. Tom McLeish, in his book, who is a biochemist, a physicist, biophysicist, in his book, Faith and Reason and Wisdom, articulates it this way. He's kind of nailed it, I guess you could say. We know better than to swallow an inadequate narrative that portrays science as simply replacing an ancient world of myth and superstition with a modern one of fact and comprehension. Science is the love of wisdom of natural things. Its primary creative grammar is the question rather than the answer. Its primary energy is imagination rather than fact. Its primary experience is more typically trial rather than triumph. Point number 2, we want to retrieve the excluded knowledge. We don't want to be shut out of certain knowledge that could be very helpful to our human flourishing. So we must retrieve excluded knowledge, break the hegemony of scientism, and address the refusal of transcendent insights. If you remember, during the Cold War, the Soviets often constructed city maps that excluded churches, a practice that made it difficult for tourists to find some of the great buildings, great church buildings in St. Petersburg and Moscow, for instance. They wanted to eliminate all memory of religion, and so they included that process in the maps that they made. The West has its own version of this. Scientism dismisses the transcendent, often quite roughly and uncritically, with a wave of the hand, you find in some authors. Or just to say that religion is completely dangerous and should be eliminated from the face of the planet. I and the field of positive psychology are sympathetic with this concern, recognizing that mature happiness, flourishing, involves values, virtues, and the transcendent. We need to bring courage, faith, and meaning to the table of serious discourse and scientific research. So faith, in fact, is involved in all positions of knowledge. We can either see the transcendent, says Charles Taylor, we can either see the transcendent as a threat, a dangerous temptation, or an obstacle to our greatest good. On the other hand, we can read it as answering to our deepest craving, our deepest need, and the fulfillment of the good. Both open and closed stances involve a step beyond the available reason into the realm of anticipatory confidence. We find this strongly articulated in Charles Taylor's chapter 15 of A Secular Age, or John Polkinghorne's book, One World. Recently, I've been reading a book by David Brooks called The Second Mountain, and he as well is articulating this view very subtly and very beautifully. So Charles Taylor is not worried by the plurality of spiritual journeys, which he calls the Nova effect. There are many spiritual journeys today, but he's concerned about the kind of spin whereby someone claims that a closed view of the cosmos is taken as obvious and conclusive, that we exist unavoidably because of science as material beings only in a material world only, a time, space, energy, matter world. The spin of closure, although not universal, is often taken as hegemonic in the academy, rendering the supernatural dimension of life unthinkable. Taylor challenges this. My concept of spin, he says, implies that one's thinking is clouded or cramped by a powerful picture which prevents one from seeing important aspects of reality. This is what we've been talking about, that there's a kind of willful philosophical blindness. Third, the recalibration of, we want to recalibrate the definition of humankind. This is point number 3. Our third move involves a challenge to scientism's character of human nature, a constricted, materialistic, or mechanistic anthropology. We want to recover our lost heritage as humanists. People that have helped us do this recently are people like Andy Crouch in his culture making book, or Jens Zimmerman, Incarnational Humanism. There is a sense in which biology needs metabiology, the reflection on meaning to allow for humans' higher capacities and aspirations. This is articulated well by Charles Taylor in The Language Animal. Science was never equipped at the end of the day to sustain a worldview, a framework of reality, called today exclusive humanism. And John Milbank shows that that is under critique and in collapse. He's a major UK intellectual. So what about biology and metabiology? I think it's important to make these distinctions. Humans must be distinguished from nature. Certainly a person is continuous with his or her natural biology, but we should not settle for views of our identity reduced to our biological origins or biological infrastructure. Humans are not only part of nature, they definitely stand apart from nature in significant ways. We need to explore these carefully and fruitfully. Materialistic naturalism lacks the explanatory range we need regarding consciousness, morality, and purpose, as is articulated by Thomas Nagel in Mind and Cosmos, and Alvin Plantinga, where Plantinga, where the conflict really lies. An example is the example of the hard problem in philosophy of mind. How does consciousness emerge out of mere matter alone? That is a testy problem. What about ethical capacity? Humans have ethical capacity. They're capable of apprehending the good and the true, the evil and the false, right and wrong. Quite an astounding ability for an animal if we are mere animals, mere social animals. Without this critical capacity, one could not expect good science or good relations among scientists. There would be no trust. I invoke the recovery of the ancient language of the good, articulated in Charles Taylor's book, The Sources of the Self, and very important in my PhD work. Ethics involves the second order desires or qualitative discriminations in one's relationship with the good. This is the whole idea of the qualities of the will. It's not just the ability to choose, but it's the quality of those choices that really matters at the end of the day. I've written a 12-part blog series in my ubcgcu.org blog on this question, the recovery of ethics through the attention to the qualities of the will. Taylor offers a robust challenge to ethical relativism, a challenge to definitions of freedom without the good, and to moral subjectivism. The quest for meaning. Well, that's what we've been talking about. Is it possible in a scientific age to still be in pursuit of meaning if we're merely the stuff of worms? The human quest for meaning and mature happiness. Leading a meaningful, meaning-centered life contributes to both happiness and virtue, as Paul Wong and other members of the positive psychology movement, like Ilona Bonnewell, say. She says, she sees the balance in positive psychology's eudaimonic happiness between the features of personal development and transcendence. That's not an enemy of her study, but a friend. Suffering, at the end of the day, is the nexus of the religious, the ethical, and the scientific, calling all parties to the table of dialogue. Recovery of meaning brings us in direct confrontation with the ideology of scientism. So in a sense, this is back to that chart on the various culture spheres, showing that if we're really looking at the meaning of life, which is heavily oriented and connected to suffering and tragedy, we need to be able to bring those culture spheres back together. And so this is really, I owe a debt of gratitude to Calvin Schrag in his book, The Self After Postmodernity, for understanding the dilemma of the culture spheres and their disconnectedness to each other. Also, as we've said before, their attempts to dominate each other. Okay, so scientism leads to nihilism, cultural decline, and human angst. To close ourselves off, to implode into a minimalist or reductionist language game, or to try to articulate all aspects of life with scientific language alone, to refuse the theological, poetic, artistic, and philosophical speech is a move towards cultural deprivation and decline. It is to be in denial of this long-standing common human heritage, this larger linguistic and moral horizon, this thick understanding of human identity. It is to refuse our fullest humanity, our fullest flourishing, to deprive us of the full academic and personal adventure, full flourishing in research, social, and political life. So this is very serious. So my conclusion at the end of the day is to celebrate science, the humanities, philosophy, and theology, but not the ideology of scientism. So as I've said, I think we can wake up and escape the ideology of scientism with some effort and critical thinking. We need a bit of critical realism. We want to affirm all the knowledge available to us, as Schumacher writes in A Guide for the Perplexed. Scientific reason alone is unable to answer all the important human questions and to offer us the robust identity and purpose we long for in our deeper self. In fact, we know things to be true in everyday life or society that we cannot prove with science alone. We need to search for other reasons, other forms of knowledge and wisdom to be whole persons. Michael Stenmark has done a brilliant job. You can find him on the internet, his commentary on 4 types of knowledge. Blaise Pascal is well known for his commentary on the reasons of the heart and the reasons of the mind, not to exclude. He was a Christian scientist and reflective person. It's not scientifically valid or fruitful to assert that the observable and empirical is all that exists. We must be open to the supernatural sources of knowledge and insight as well, to epiphany or revelation. And Alistair McGrath has done a really fine job of this. He looks at the shape of the universe and sees the importance of the complementary relationship between natural science and theology, that one without the other is not complete. Beautiful book, really, just a masterful book. He's at the Center for Science and Theology at Oxford University. Truth is an activity, a judgment inextricably linked to the good and to love. This kind of truth is an important prerequisite for healthy humans on the path to freedom, moral agency, and responsibility. It operates within a robust meaning culture, which involves purpose, belonging, transcendence, and a redemptive narrative. N.T. Wright puts it this way: we cannot know what we do not love. We cannot love what we do not know. This is critical realism. We'll be having a talk at UBC on critical realism this January 27th, and it'll be available on our blog for directions to the Zoom link. That's at ubcgcu.org and ubcgfcf.com. So here's our discussion in review. I think sometimes it's good to sum up what we've discussed or talked about. Scientism is the notion that natural science constitutes the most authoritative worldview or form of human knowledge, and that it is superior to all other interpretations of life. It assumes an immanent closed world system which rejects the validity of any transcendent elements to reality. There exists a strong attraction to the idea that we are in an order of nature, that we do not and cannot transcend it. In scientism, the study and methods of natural science have morphed into an ideology, producing a state of methodological imperialism. Scientism also indicates the improper usage of science or scientific claims in contexts where science might not properly apply, such as when the topic is perceived to be beyond the scope of scientific inquiry, i.e. or e.g. to determine a worldview or final purpose, or to comment on religion. The stance of scientism may indicate in an overconfident fashion a scientific certainty in realms where that kind of certainty is not actually possible. The person overreaches the proper limits of science in a process which can thereby discredit science itself. This has some serious consequences for humans and society, as we've said. So again, here's some bibliography of the various speakers in this area, and highly recommend them. You can go back and look at this. This is my book, The Great Escape from Nihilism, Rediscovering Our Passion in Late Modernity, where I take this issue apart in more detail and show the way forward. So this has been a discussion on late modernity and the challenge of scientism and the quest for meaning. So thanks for listening, and I hope this has been insightful and helpful. I just have one more slide on the existential crisis of millennials, which is part of the problem of scientism, that they've inherited this particular problem. So thanks very much, and I wish you all the best in your thinking about scientism and the quest for meaning. Bye.